She realized the moment her life ended had nothing to do with her heartbeat. It was when they made her stand naked in the snow and called it sorting. The year was somewhere at the edge of a monk's memory. The place was a nameless village on the coastline of a Christian land that had believed its prayers could keep ships away. At dawn, the bells had rung for service. By mid-morning, they rang for nothing at all. Now she stood with 40 other women in a line that had once been a street, the houses around them smoking and half collapsed. The Vikings moved along the row with the calm efficiency of men counting livestock. They didn't shout, they didn't rage. That would have made it passion. This was business. One man, his beard braided with coins, carried a staff that he used to lift chins and turn faces toward the pale winter light. Another walked behind him with a wax tablet scratching symbols that meant prices, ages, destinations. They spoke in a language she didn't know, but she understood the pattern. When the staff touched a woman's shoulder and the scribe nodded, she was pushed into the group on the left. When the staff passed over a woman without stopping, she was shoved into the group on the right. The ones too old or too sick lay where they had fallen in the first minutes of the raid, their bodies already dusted with ash and frost. Her name in the life she no longer had was Ira. No one here would ever use it. When the man with the staff reached her, he didn't ask. He gripped her jaw hard enough to bruise, turned her face to the light, then dragged his hand down her arm to feel the muscle. He pressed his thumb into the calluses on her palm, testing for labor, not for pain. His eyes didn't linger on her the way men's eyes did when they wanted. They slid over her as if she were a tool, not an object of desire. In the strange arithmetic of what was coming, that was not mercy. That was a different kind of sentence. Field, he muttered in his own tongue, jerking his head toward the left. The scribe nodded and scratched. Ira was pushed into the cluster of women the Vikings had decided were strong enough to work until their backs broke. To her right, a girl no older than 13 was marked for another group. The one where faces were younger, eyes wider, shoulders narrower. They huddled together instinctively, but the Vikings separated them with a few casual blows, not angry, not rushed, just practical. Ira had grown up hearing that the worst thing Vikings did was kill quickly and without warning. But as she watched them divide the survivors, she realized something far more disturbing. The killing had been the easy part. The real work was happening now. That was the first truth most people never hear. The brutality of what Vikings did to captured women did not explode all at once in fire and steel. It unfolded in systems, in decisions, in categories. The men around her were not drunk with bloodlust. They were sober with commerce. Behind the main group of raiders, others moved through the houses, dragging out chests, tools, religious objects. Gold and silver were piled together, but the most careful handling was reserved for the captives. Ira saw it in the way they guarded the line of women more closely than the heap of stolen chalices. You can bury gold, you can hide silver, but the wealth that breathes can run, fight, burn, scream. It needs to be managed, not just taken. When the sun was high enough to glare off the snow, they began the march to the shore. The men carried little. They had made room on the ships by throwing overboard anything that wasn't profitable. That was the second truth. For Viking raiders, captured women were not an afterthought. They were the cargo the journey was planned around. Ira's village had always been told that the Vikings came for treasure, that they wanted coins and crosses and relics. It was easier to believe that. It implied that if you were poor, if you lived simply, you were safe. But as they crested the last rise and she saw the ships below, black shapes against churning gray water, she understood the lie. Ropes reached out from the shore like veins, pulsing with movement as captives were funneled toward the longships. The vessels themselves looked like beasts at rests, sleek, hungry, patient. Men moved along their decks with a familiarity that made everything feel rehearsed, as if her terror had been staged 100 times before in 100 other villages. It had. She stumbled as they forced her down the slope, her bare feet slipping in the frozen mud. A blow between her shoulder blades drove the air from her lungs and her knees into the ground. Rough hands jerked her up again. She didn't see which raider had struck her. It didn't matter. None of this was personal. That was part of what made it worse. On the beach, the sorting intensified. Women were bound in groups of 6, ropes tied around their necks and waists, forcing them to move in clumsy unison. A man with rings on every finger walked along the line, muttering calculations to himself. Ira caught fragments of meaning, numbers, weights, distances. How many bodies a ship could safely carry without capsizing. How long they could go before they would need to stop for water. How much profit this raid would produce in Dublin, Hidaby, Novgorod. Imagine for a moment the story you've been told about Vikings. Warriors with axes raised, screaming battle cries, dying gloriously under open sky. Now place that image beside another one. A woman bent over a grindstone for 16 hours a day until her spine collapses. A girl sold 3 times before her 15th year. Not because she did anything, but because she was worth more if moved frequently. A mother watching her child taken from her arms not for punishment, but because separating them made both easier to control. Only one of those images is considered epic enough to carve into history. But it's the other one that paid for the ships. As Ira was forced up the plank and onto the heaving deck of the nearest longship, she heard one of the raiders laugh, not at her, not at any of the women, at a joke about how many coins their captain would make when they reached the slave market. His amusement was casual, almost bored. In that moment she understood the third truth. The worst brutality was not always in what they did with their hands. It was in how little it meant to them. You are about to hear what Vikings did to captured women that was more brutal than any battle, not because it was louder, not because it was bloodier in a single instant, but because it was designed to last. Battles ended in hours. What awaited Ira and countless others was crafted to stretch across years, across generations, turning living people into the infrastructure of a civilization. If you think you know Viking cruelty from what you've seen in war scenes, understand this. The battlefield was only the doorway. What lay beyond it was a system so cold, so methodical, that even some of their enemies hesitated to write it down. This is the part they tried to forget. This is what it meant to be taken alive. The ship moved before Ira understood what movement meant now. The shoreline receded, her village shrinking into a smear of smoke and memory, and the rope around her waist tightened as the women bound together adjusted to the rhythm of the sea. Below deck, the air tasted of wet wood, iron, and fear. They were pushed down the narrow opening one by one, heads forced low so they wouldn't crack against the beams. Space had been calculated with precision. Not enough room to stand. Not enough room to lie fully flat. Enough to keep bodies alive, pliable, and moving forward. This was not improvisation. The Vikings knew exactly how many women they could pack beneath the deck before losses began to outweigh profit. The first night taught Ira another rule of survival. Noise was dangerous. Screaming drew attention, not help. The guards above didn't need silence for sleep. They needed it so they could hear anything that differed from the normal sounds of suffering. Whispers blended into the groan of wood and waves. Sharp cries did not. When a young woman began to sob uncontrollably, a shape appeared at the hatch. A hand came down holding a blunt object. There was a thud. The sobbing stopped. The body remained breathing but quieter. The message didn't need repeating. Time lost its ordinary meaning almost immediately. Day and night blurred into darkness, punctuated by brief burning moments of light when the hatch opened. Those moments brought water, sometimes food, sometimes men they recognized, sometimes men they didn't. It took Ira days to understand that the visits weren't random. They followed a hierarchy as strict as any battlefield formation. The raid leader chose first, then the men who had distinguished themselves, then others, rotating in a way that prevented patterns that might lead to resistance. Even here, even now, there was organization. That is the fourth truth people refuse to face. What Vikings did to captured women was not chaotic cruelty. It was regulated, controlled, embedded into law and custom so deeply that it could be repeated across thousands of miles from the British Isles to the edge of the Byzantine world, with grim consistency. Arabic chroniclers wrote about it with horror. Christian monks recorded it with disgust. Even some Norse sources hinted at it in the spaces between heroic deeds. But no one stopped it because it wasn't seen as excess. It was seen as function. By the time the ship reached its first port, 2 women were no longer breathing. They were unbound and lifted without ceremony. Their bodies went into the water, splashing briefly before vanishing beneath the waves. No prayer, no marker. Dead cargo had no value beyond freeing space. The living were retied more tightly, the loss computed silently. The port was not the end of anything. It was a sorting station. Wooden posts rose from muddy ground, lashed together to form enclosures. Smoke hung low, thick with the smell of tar, sweat, and commerce. Traders moved through the space with practiced eyes, examining teeth, hands, hair. Ira was brought up onto the shore and made to stand again, cold biting into her skin. The same staff appeared, lifting faces, pressing into muscle. Marks were called out, scribbles added to tablets. Some women were pulled away immediately. Others were herded back toward the ship, reassigned to future destinations. This was where the system revealed its full depth. There were markets for different kinds of suffering. Women who could work fields were valuable in isolated settlements building farms out of hostile land. Women who were young and healthy were designated for reproduction, their children automatically inheriting their status. Women with skills, spinning, weaving, languages, healing were worth more, not because those skills would save them, but because they extended their usefulness. Survival itself became a currency, something extended or shortened based on value. Ira was sold within an hour. A man from inland counted out silver into the raid leader's hands. No bargaining, no raised voices, just a nod. She was now property transferred through a transaction so mundane it barely registered to the men involved. Quote, she was marched inland with 4 others, ropes connecting them like animals. The path was well worn. This route had been taken many times before. The settlement lay far from the water, surrounded by rough fields clawed out of unforgiving soil. Here, Vikings weren't raiders. They were landowners, they farmed, they built, they raised children, and under that ordinary surface lay the 5th truth. The brutality didn't stop once the ships were gone. It became quieter, slower, but no less complete. Ira was assigned to a house before the day ended. She was shown the grindstone at dawn. 2 massive stones, one atop the other, with a wooden handle worn smooth by years of use. The woman who had turned it before her had died 2 days earlier, her heart failing after seasons of the same motion. The man who owned the house explained the task with gestures and a few words of a language Ira was beginning to understand. She would turn the stone, grain in, flour out. She would do this until told otherwise. Food would come when the work justified it. Days collapsed into weeks. Her hands split and bled, then hardened. Her back learned pain so intimate it became a companion. She slept where she fell, waking to bone-deep cold and the dull certainty that this would happen again. Occasionally, traders passed through, and Ira would see women she recognized brought out, inspected, traded away. The constant movement kept them disoriented, uprooted. Stability, even brutal stability, could breed hope. Hope was dangerous. The law supported all of this. In the assemblies where free men argued and settled disputes, enslaved women existed only as values. Harm done to them was calculated in silver owed to their owners, not in justice owed to them. If a woman was injured and could no longer work, compensation went to the man who lost labor, not to the woman who lost function. The language of law erased them completely. They were not wronged. They were damaged property. This is where comparison with battle becomes almost obscene. In battle, death could come swiftly. Glory, however twisted, was attached to it. Songs remembered names, but here there were no songs. No sagas about the woman whose hands were destroyed by grinding grain. No poems for the girl shipped east, traded until her original language vanished from her mouth. Their suffering was not dramatic enough for legend. It was simply necessary. Years passed in this quiet hell. Ira learned enough Norse to understand instructions, but not enough to make arguments. She learned when to lower her eyes and when not doing so might be taken as defiance. She learned that winter was a different kind of punishment when work continued despite darkness and cold that cracked skin and spirit alike. Children grew around her, some born to enslaved women, some free. The difference between them was clear almost immediately in how they were spoken to, how they were touched, how their futures were imagined. One winter, a ship arrived at the fjord carrying men who spoke a different dialect. Traders. They examined the household, counting assets. Ira was brought forward again. Her teeth were checked. Her hands judged still useful. She was older now, less valuable, but not without worth. The men debated briefly. She could fetch a moderate price in the east, where labor was scarce. Or she could remain where she was, worked until she failed entirely. The decision came down to logistics. The eastbound ship had room. Ira was unmade for the second time as she was sold again. The faces around her changed. The land changed. The rules remained. What Vikings did to captured women was not about rage. It was about replacement. Men could be killed in battle and replaced with sons, brothers, allies. But women, taken alive, could replace entire populations. They built fields. They gave birth. They ensured continuity. They were the unseen engine beneath the violence, the reason raids lasted centuries instead of burning out quickly. By the time Ira stood on another shore, chained among strangers, she no longer thought of escape. Not because she lacked courage, but because the system was total. Every path led back into the same machinery. Death was the only exit, and even that was often delayed because her body was still useful. If you are listening to this and feeling unsettled, you should. This is not an exaggeration born of modern judgment. Contemporary sources, archaeology, and law codes align on this reality. Viking brutality toward captured women was not worse than any battle because it was more violent in a moment, but because it was quieter, longer, and designed to erase people without spectacle. Ira's name would never be written, but her life was not unusual. She was a single thread in a vast fabric of suffering that funded ships, farms, and settlements we still admire today. And as long as we talk about Viking history without talking about women like her, we are finishing the work her captors started, making her disappear. They taught her very early that suffering was not an accident in the Viking world. It was policy, it was structure, it was law. The worst part was not the first beating, the first night on the ship, or the first season of work until her hands bled. The worst part was when she realized that what was happening to her was not a mistake or a crime. It was how the system had been designed to function, step by step, clause by clause, rune by rune. In the Norse world, captured women were not just victims of war. They were infrastructure. On an Icelandic farm in the year 960, a girl named Astrid discovered this truth the day a freeborn child pushed her into the mud. She couldn't have been more than 7. She had tried to join a game near the longhouse, laughing, running, just another child chasing a wooden hoop. The other girl shoved her with a force too focused to be casual, eyes flashing with something she didn't yet have words for. Thrill brat, the girl spat. Slave brat. The insult hit harder than the fall. Astrid crawled back to the corner of the yard where her mother was grinding grain, tears streaking her dirt-covered face. Her mother wiped her cheek with a calloused thumb, then did the cruelest, kindest thing she could. She explained. "You are not a person in their law," she said. "You are a thing. You cannot say no. You cannot own anything. You cannot bear witness. You cannot stand in an assembly and speak. If you are hurt, the payment goes to the man who owns you, not to you. If you have a child, that child is not yours. It belongs to the same man." Astrid listened as her entire concept of self narrowed. A slave was not someone who happened to be owned. A slave was someone whose body, future, and even pain existed on somebody else's balance sheet. The law that made this true had a name, GRGS, the Grey Goose Code of Iceland. It treated captured women with a precision that left no room for dignity. A slave woman's body belonged entirely to her owner. If someone else harmed her, compensation was calculated like damage to tools or livestock. If she died, the question wasn't who mourned her. It was who pays for the loss of property. One case recorded in the Sagas tells of a woman named Asa, a captured Irish girl in her 20s, struck and killed when 2 free men fought over a boundary dispute. The law speaker didn't consider murder. He calculated her age, her weaving skill, her remaining expected years of labor. The man who killed her owed her owner 8 marks of silver. That was all. No one asked what Asa might have become. The law did not recognize her as a who, only as a what Vikings did to captured women was worse than any battle because battles ended. The law didn't. It followed them into every hour of every day like a collar around the neck of their identity. Children inherited their mother's status automatically. It didn't matter if their father was a free farmer, a chieftain, even a king. If the mother was a thrill, the child was a thrill. Bloodlines that would, in another world, have produced leaders and poets were locked into generational bondage by a single line of text recited at assemblies. The slave woman's child is a slave. Men could change status by wealth, by oath, by adoption. Women taken in war passed slavery into their descendants like a hereditary disease. 3 generations of one family show how this worked in practice. The grandmother, taken from Scotland at 15, still remembered the sound of bagpipes, the smell of peat smoke, the feel of rain on her village's cobblestones. At night she whispered those memories to her daughter in a language no one else on the farm understood. The daughter, born in Iceland, had never seen Scotland. She knew freedom only as story, not experience. Her survival depended not on dreaming of a life outside, but on learning every rule inside. How to avoid making eye contact at the wrong moment. How to work quickly without appearing defiant. How to sense an owner's mood from the scrape of his boots on the floorboards. The granddaughter didn't even have that. For her, slavery was not a condition. It was the shape of the world. She didn't consider escape. She couldn't imagine a world where she was allowed to decide what to do with her own hands. The damage went far beyond broken backs and scarred skin. It carved itself into minds. Women who lived their whole lives under the threat of instant punishment learned early to flinch at sudden movement, to shrink into themselves whenever voices rose. Hypervigilance became their only real shield, always watching, always listening, always calculating risk. Sleep was shallow. Rest was a rumor. When violence came, many learned to leave their own bodies in self-defense. They dissociated, staring at a fixed point on the wall while their minds drifted, somewhere anywhere else. Over time, some never fully came back. They moved through the longhouse like ghosts, responding to commands but never laughing, never sharing stories, never letting their real selves surface, dead but still breathing. And yet even in this carefully engineered cage, resistance found cracks. What Vikings did to captured women was not just to break them, it was to underestimate how dangerous broken things can become. Women learned the one power they still had. They were trusted near everything. Owners could not live without food, drink, children's secrets. A woman who stirred the pot also chose the herbs. A woman who brewed the ale decided what went into the barrel. A woman who held a child at night heard things whispered in the dark that were never meant to reach enemy ears. One Irish woman, brought to Norway because of her skill with brewing, learned which mushrooms growing near the farm caused slow, undetectable sickness. Over months, she crushed them in tiny amounts into the drink of the man who had purchased her family, watching his health fail while everyone blamed the long winter. When he finally died, they said it was the gods. She knew better. Another woman, this time from Wales, moved through 4 different households as property was traded and debts paid. In each place, she served in the kitchen, learned the layout, observed who was cruel and who pretended not to see. One night she slipped out, set 3 different barns on fire, and vanished into the woods. They found her body days later, frozen. The story they told afterward was that she'd gone mad. The story she wrote in flames was that even someone considered less than human could still choose the terms of her last act. There were mothers who chose an even harsher path. They looked at their newborns and saw not hope, but another body added to the ledger. Some took their babies to the river at night, tears freezing on their faces, whispering apologies as they let tiny forms slide beneath the surface. Norse law recorded this as loss of property, another mark in the Book of Compensations. The Sagas mention it only as an aside, a strange, cruel thing some women did. They never ask why, because the why is simple and unbearable. Some mothers decided that one brief moment of water and darkness was kinder than an entire lifetime of being owned. Psychological scars passed in ways no law could track. Children raised in these conditions learned from the beginning that they were not allowed to protect the people they loved. Sons watched mothers insulted and could not rise. Daughters watched sisters disappear into ships and could not follow. The lesson was carved into them over and over. Your feelings are irrelevant. Your pain is irrelevant. Your loyalty is irrelevant. Only your output matters. That kind of lesson doesn't end when a person dies. It shapes how their descendants carry themselves generations later, quiet voices, flinching at certain tones, a tendency to overwork to earn safety that never truly comes. What Vikings did to captured women was worse than any battle because it aimed at something war usually leaves untouched. The ability to imagine yourself as fully human. Blade and fire destroy bodies. Systems destroy selfhood. In Hidibi, Dublin, Novgorod, and smaller trading posts all along the routes, women were numbered, recorded, moved like packs of grain. That bureaucracy left fewer visible wounds than an axe blow, but its purpose was the same, to make sure no one saw them as daughters, lovers, thinkers, healers, just labor, just breeding potential, just value on a market spectrum that ran from high to disposable. And yet tiny acts of refusal kept sparking, even in the darkest corners. Lullaby sung in a banned language, a piece of bread hidden for someone weaker, a story about a homeland the child would never see, told anyway. These were not victories in the way sagas count them. No hall was won, no king unseated. But they were victories over the one thing the system wanted most, total erasure. As long as one enslaved woman remembered who she had been before, or who her mother had been, the machine of dehumanization had not fully succeeded. Centuries later, when historians dig into sagas, legal codes, and buried foundations of old slave markets, they find gaps, inconsistencies, places where the official story doesn't quite line up with physical evidence, bones in graves that don't match the names in the texts, traces of lives that shouldn't be there if the written version were complete. Those gaps are not mistakes. They are the shadows cast by all those women whose suffering was never meant to leave a trace. The fact that we can even talk about them now is itself a crack in the design. And that is the real brutality, not just what Vikings did with sword and fire, but what their entire world was built to ignore afterward. The captured women were supposed to disappear, into work, into law, into myth that never mentioned them. The reason their story hits so hard today is simple. We are not supposed to have it. We are looking at a blueprint that was meant to stay buried. They called it the end of the Viking Age, as if brutality stopped when the long ships vanished from the rivers. It didn't. It changed shape. It traded oars for ledgers, iron for paper, open markets for hidden rooms. The world pretended it had moved on, but the architecture the Vikings built for controlling, trading, and erasing women did not disappear. It went underground. It blurred its own reflection. It learned new names. When Christian kings finally consolidated power in Scandinavia, they wrote laws condemning the heathen practices of their ancestors. They banned pagan temples, outlawed certain sacrifices, forced churches to rise where altars to older gods once stood. But they did not dismantle the mindset that made women into resources. They didn't know how. Many didn't want to. The same families who once trafficked women under Thor's hammer continued to profit under the sign of the cross. Only the justifications changed, not the hunger. In Iceland, the descendants of enslaved women married into free families, their origins deliberately blurred. Sagas would later describe proud lineages, poetic feuds, honorable duels, but skip over how many of those honorable men were the great-grandsons of women taken from Irish monasteries, Scottish farms, Frankish villages. In Norway and Denmark, old slave routes became trade routes for other goods. The memories of what those paths once carried sank into the soil like blood washed away by too many winters. The church condemned some abuses, but the deeper structure stayed. Women were still treated as bargaining pieces in marriage alliances, still used to cement treaties, still punished harder for dishonor than the men who caused it. The Viking system of total legal control over female bodies faded from law books, but survived in habits, in jokes, in unspoken rules. People forgot where it came from. The damage didn't forget. The traces are everywhere if you know how to look. Archaeologists digging in former Viking ports keep finding iron shackles and layers of soil that also contain coins from Baghdad, weights for measuring silver, and fragments of Christian crosses sold as scrap. In Dublin, the same ground that supports trendy cafes and tourist shops sits on top of what was once Europe's largest slave market. The museum plaques talk about trade and connections. They rarely say plainly what was being traded. Who? In Iceland, genetic studies reveal a population where most male ancestry is Scandinavian, but a majority of maternal ancestry is Celtic. That doesn't point to romantic travel stories. It points to ships filled with women who never chose their destination. In Norway, certain farm names can be traced back to families known in sagas for having many servants from over the sea. The records don't list those servants' names. They do list how many sheep the farms owned, how many cows, how many horses. Human beings and livestock, line after line in the same ink. Modern Scandinavia sells a different image now. Equality, safety, social welfare. To an extent, it's real. Laws protect women in ways Viking lawmakers would have found unthinkable. But history doesn't vanish because new values arrive. Trauma doesn't evaporate because a region becomes wealthy and progressive. The descendants of enslaved women live for generations in societies that built their stability on unspoken violence. That leaves Markson's family stories half told, and inherited fears no one can quite explain. In the way some histories are told loudly and others barely whispered, the Viking Age ended more than 1,000 years ago. Human trafficking did not. Today, across the world, women and girls are still transported across borders, sorted by age, appearance, and market value, forced into systems of control that look disturbingly like the ones described in early medieval chronicles. The paperwork is digital now instead of carved into bone or scratched on parchment. The buyers wear suits instead of mail. The warehouses have fluorescent lighting instead of torches. But the logic is the same: target the vulnerable. Erase their individuality. Turn them into units, profit. When people romanticize Vikings in pop culture hornless helmets, roaring warriors, storm-tossed ships, they rarely picture the lower decks. They imagine chosen warriors feasting in Valhalla, not the chained women forced into lives far worse than death. They wear Thor's hammer as a symbol of strength without remembering that the owners of those hammers used it as an excuse to treat half the population as expendable. It would be easy to dismiss all this as just how it was back then, a product of a harsh age where no one could afford modern morality. But that excuse ignores something crucial. Even in the sagas, even in the chronicles written by frightened monks, there are glimmers of people who knew this was wrong. A few chieftains who freed women instead of selling them. Priests who emptied church treasuries to buy captives back. Women who risked their lives to poison abusers, burn markets, destroy ships. The existence of resistance proves that everyone didn't accept this as normal. They just lost. History usually follows the winners. That's why you don't learn these stories in school. That's why museum tours glide past the slave auctions to talk about shipbuilding techniques. That's why TV shows linger on blood-soaked battlefields but blur or soften what happened afterwards to the prisoners taken there. It's easier to cheer for a culture if you ignore the foundations it was built on. But ignoring a foundation doesn't make it disappear. It just makes the house above unstable. Maybe you feel that already is a quiet discomfort whenever Vikings are presented as noble anti-heroes, a sense that something important is being left out. That discomfort is healthy. It's the mind's way of telling you the official version has holes. This story of women captured, sorted, commodified, and erased is one of the things that spill out through those cracks. Remember the girl in the monastery who hid in the grain store and was dragged out anyway? Remember the woman who ground grain 12 hours a day until her hands became twisted knots? Remember the noble daughter married to the man who killed her father, forced to raise children who would raid her own people? Remember the women who chose to drown, to burn, to throw themselves into volcanoes or off ships rather than live one more day as property? Remember the ones who stayed alive not because they were weak, but because they refused to let their cultures, their stories, their languages die with them? The Viking world would not have functioned without them. Every farm that fed warriors, every longship provisioned for raids, every hall cleaned and repaired and supplied, every child raised to lift a sword or trade silver, the invisible labor of captured women made that possible. Their suffering was not a side effect. It was part of the engine. We remember kings, raiders, explorers, and poets by name. We remember most of these women only as statistics, if we remember them at all. The point of a story like this is not to make you despise all Viking history or to glorify suffering for its own sake. It's to restore balance. To place beside every image of a shining longship cutting across a cold sea an awareness of who might be chained below deck. To remind you that heroism built on the bodies of the voiceless is not heroism at all, it's theft. And once you see that theft clearly in the past, it becomes much harder to ignore in the present. Because somewhere right now there's a woman sitting in a locked room packed into a truck, trapped in a contract she never freely signed, being told by men who profit from her that no one will ever come for her, that no one will ever know, that no one will ever care. The Vikings told their captives the same thing 1,000 years ago. They were wrong. We are talking about them now. If this story has stayed with you, if it has made the usual legends sit differently in your chest, don't let that feeling pass. Let it change the way you look at every glorious narrative built on unnamed suffering. Let it make you ask, every time you hear about empires, conquests, golden ages, who paid for this, and why don't I know their names? What Vikings did to captured women was more brutal than any battle because battles ended. What was done to them didn't. It echoed through bloodlines, through laws, through silences that lasted centuries. And the only real way to break that echo is to refuse to let it stay hidden. If you're ready to keep walking into the parts of history that polite stories skipped, the erased, the uncomfortable, the brutally honest, then don't stop here. Seek out the next chapter. Listen for the voices that were never meant to be heard. And whenever you see a polished myth about warriors and glory, remember there is always another version, buried just beneath the surface, waiting for someone stubborn enough to dig. Today that someone was you.